Now I've asked Andrew. You might know him. He was actually in this room or this house just a few months ago. He is a South African. He used to be an advisor to Nelson Mandela. He tried to topple Keir Starmer in London, almost successfully. He reduced Starmer's support dramatically, embarrassed him quite dramatically. Next time maybe we can remove that man, okay? Andrew has written many books, but one in particular. And you may know it's been filmed, The Shadow World. You can look it up on YouTube. It's the text inside the global arms trade. A devastating and scrupulous documented account of the greed, venality, and rampant corruption pervading the global arms trade. Andrew Feinstein has produced a brilliant and massively important book, says an American military chief. Andrew, we know about the word perpetual war. We know Immanuel Kant talks about perpetual peace. You may be somewhere in between.
Thanks. Thank you very much, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It's always a great pleasure to be in Oslo, to be in Norway. I'm rushing back after this to Trondheim, where Mick, Claire and I are speaking in the Transform Festival, where we had a panel the other night with a number of brothers and sisters from Palestine who gave us a first-hand account of what is happening there. The military official who John quoted as reviewing the book is actually someone who resigned from the American military, whose work, if you're interested in militarism, you should definitely look up. His name is Andrew Bacevich. He was a lieutenant colonel in the American Marines. He left the American military because he believed it had become a force for evil in the world, not good. And tragically, when we interviewed him for the Shadow World film, 3 months before, his son, who despite his father's experience had decided to join the Marines, was killed in Iraq. On Sunday, I'll be launching in Belgium a book with Jeremy Corbyn called Monstrous Anger of the Guns: How the Arms Trade is Ruining Our World and What We Can Do About It. And perhaps that's very important for the subject matter of this evening's discussion. I'm also working on another book, which sadly will only be ready next week because I write my books very slowly, with the somewhat tragic title, Making a Killing: How the West Profits from Slaughter in Yemen and Gaza. Because that's what's been happening. It's not just that we are enabling and facilitating these conflicts. We are profiting from them. And I'll try and explain how. What Claire described as happening in the EU has been happening globally. In the United States of America, across Europe, in Britain, in the so-called Western world, we see what the American philosopher C. Wright Mills described as a militarist mindset take hold in a way that perhaps it never has in human history, where everything in our lives is perceived through a militarist lens. We have a war on drugs. We have a war on obesity. we have a war on migrants. And as Claire pointed out, that particular war is a consequence of our arming conflicts that have caused populations to have to flee their homes and to attempt to come to our countries, where the same companies who profit from the bombs profit from keeping them out of our countries. And when we think about differences, about resolving differences, we think only of conflict, which is reflected to me in the reality that the government of the United States of America employs more people to run one aircraft carrier than it has diplomats across the entire world. And the United States of America has 12 aircraft carriers, which tells you exactly where its priorities lie. In Gaza, as Claire pointed out, and as we all know, I was incredibly proud of my own country, South Africa, when we took Israel to the International Court of Justice. And it was incredibly symbolic that it was South Africa that did that, because we had standing before the highest court in the world a black lawyer, a female lawyer of South Asian origin, a fairly old white male lawyer, and a wonderful Irish lawyer. But what that diversity of South African society reflected before that court is that the oppressed have become the lawyers and the judges in a free and democratic country. And that we, South Africans, who have overcome a system of apartheid, who liberated ourselves with the help of tens of millions around the world, we are holding to account another nation that is practicing apartheid and genocide. And that legal argument, which the chief rabbi of South Africa described as an anti-Semitic screed and a blood libel, which tells you everything you need to know about the chief rabbinate in South Africa. A religious authority that only deigned to criticize the system of apartheid for the first time and very politely in 1985, which was only about 340 years after the system of apartheid had been established in South Africa by European settler colonialists. And again, the symbolism of the fact that a country that had suffered the consequences of settler colonialism was calling out in the highest court in the world another country that has practiced settler colonialism and that has the support of Europe and the West. And we are seeing that country, Israel, and I say this as a Jew, not in spite of the fact that I am Jewish, but because of the fact that I am Jewish. A Jew who is the son of a Holocaust survivor, who lost dozens of her family in Auschwitz, where I have lectured on genocide prevention. A Jew who introduced the first ever motion in the entire history of the South African Parliament when I became an MP in 1994. A motion on the Holocaust and its meaning for us in South Africa and the world. We have the state of Israel committing a genocide before our eyes that we witness every single day on our screens. A genocide that is destroying every single item of infrastructure in Gaza and in parts of the West Bank. And they are doing that with 70% of the weapons provided by the US and the balance of those weapons provided by the EU and the UK. But in addition to that, by perpetrating this genocide and by giving Israel uncritical support, which is what all of our governments in the so-called West have done, we have decided that it is more important to support this apartheid occupying state than it is to maintain the architecture of the international rule of law that was established in the wake of World War II to prevent another Holocaust. And for me, the greatest irony is to see Germany, a country that has committed 2 genocides, because we should not forget the Herero people of Namibia. Just as we should not forget the victims of the Holocaust, both the 6 million Jews and the 6 million other people who the Nazis decided were inferior and could therefore be murdered. To see Germany contort itself politically, psychologically, in order to defend Israel is one of the most humiliating and hypocritical things I have ever seen in my 60 years on this earth. In that destruction of the international rule of law, we have also laid bare the lie that we have any form of arms export controls in the world. Because how can we, when we can on a daily basis provide the weapons that are tearing apart the flesh of young children, of women, and of men, whose only crime is to be born Palestinian? And it doesn't matter to our governments that our domestic laws insist that weapons should not be exported if there is a likelihood that they will increase harm done to civilians. When we have the evidence of that harm every single day, all day, on our screens. And we are doing this to protect a state that my former boss, Nelson Mandela, and someone who I was incredibly privileged and honored to call a political mentor and a friend, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, both of whom understood apartheid far better than I ever could as a privileged white South African, which is the ultimate form of privilege the world has ever known. They described Israel as perpetrating a system of apartheid far worse than anything we experienced in South Africa. Why? Because in South Africa, we were entirely dependent on those we oppressed as an enslaved labor force to mine the natural resources that made our country wealthy. Whereas in Israel, they do not have a similar economic dependency on the Palestinians. The South African apartheid regime would never have slaughtered over 40,000 black South Africans, because that would have meant 40,000 people they needed to retrain in their workforce. We are not just, though, protecting Israel. We are not just enabling and facilitating a genocide in real time. We, and when I say we, our countries, our companies, and our politicians are profiting from what is happening in Gaza. And I can think of nothing worse that we as human beings could be doing. So why do I say that? The global trade in weapons accounts for around 40% of all corruption in all world trade. 40%. Why? Because the transactions involve tens of billions of dollars, are decided on by a very tiny group of people, and all take place behind a veil of national security imposed secrecy. So it is virtually impossible to get information into the public domain and remain out of prison about anything that happens in an arms transaction. It's why when The Shadow World was first published in late 2011, it was the first book published on the global arms trade since 1979. And that's another reason why Julian Assange had to be kept in prison, and why there was the prospect of him dying in an American prison. Because he started to reveal those national security secrets that our leaders so desperately don't want us to know. And it is these bribes that provide the financial oil for our political systems and for our politicians. The biggest contributors to the main political parties in the Western world since the Second World War are the defense companies, the weapons makers. And it's not just the political parties who benefit. It's the companies who benefit. The Financial Times on Friday gleefully announced that the defense companies just in Europe and the UK would be earning an additional $52 billion over the next 6 to 12 months because of the situation in Yemen and Gaza. That's what our mainstream media thinks of what is happening in these places. Great market opportunities for our companies. Why could Keir Starmer not call for a ceasefire in Gaza? Why is he terrified of actually halting arms sales rather than the nonsense announcement his foreign secretary made on Monday that they are stopping 10% of weapons exported to Israel while stopping none of the weapons that are actually causing death and destruction? Because for this past election, he received from one South African billionaire £5.5 million, the biggest single individual donation to the Labour Party. And what is that particular individual concerned about? Ensuring that there is no wealth tax and ensuring that Keir Starmer does nothing that Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't approve of. That is the reality of our politics, which are broken. In the Western world today, we have the best democracies money can buy because they are bought and paid for. And the weapons makers are amongst the most generous of those political donors. And don't forget the individuals, from Helmut Kohl to Franz Josef Strauss to former Commission President Barroso. You give me any country in Europe and I'll tell you which of their politicians have benefited from this industry. Or like my favorite, Keir Starmer's godfather, if you will, Tony Blair, who since he left office, directly out of the decision to invade Iraq and his association with British arms companies, has personally made in excess of £110 million. So Keir Starmer knows if he only lasts as long as Liz Truss, if any of you have ever heard that name, who was our Prime Minister for about 30 seconds and cost the British taxpayer £74 billion because of her incompetence, if he only lasts the 49 days that she does, he'll be a multimillionaire for the rest of his life because of the decisions he'll make in those 49 days. That is the nature of our politics today. And that's a country that has the highest number of billionaires we've ever had and has more families needing to use food banks than at any time since the end of the Second World War. The world has gone mad. And Gaza is just the most obvious manifestation of it. So what do? We, as individuals, as ordinary people, have a responsibility to take on our sclerotic, corrupt, mendacious, and mediocre politicians and political process. We have to refuse to vote for these people. And if there are not people worth voting for, we have to stand ourselves against them. And this independence movement of independent candidates really caught the imagination in the last British election, where we now have 5 independent MPs, whereas in the previous 55 years, we've had a total of 2. When it comes to Israel and our arms, we have to employ the tactic that was so effective in bringing about an end to apartheid in South Africa: boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which brought the apartheid South African economy to its knees and was the most important factor in ending apartheid in South Africa, and is something we can all participate in every time we walk into a supermarket. And direct action. You know, I've been doing this work for almost 23 years now. But there's a group in Britain called Palestine Action, which now has branches in America, in Australia, and in various European countries, who actually occupy the factories of Elbit Systems, is one of Israel's largest arms companies, that used to have 10 factories in Britain. Because of Palestine Action, 3 of those factories have had to close down, so they now only have 7. They have done more in the 3 years they've existed than me and my colleagues have done in the 23 years we've been doing this work. And finally, if this situation continues, we must follow the example of military veterans in the United States of America who refuse to pay 30% of their tax. Why? Because 30 cents in every dollar paid to the American tax authorities goes to Lockheed Martin and the other defense contractors. And we should do the same thing in our country. Let me conclude by saying, I am very fortunate in that I come from a country who, through the extraordinary courage of millions of our own people, who made our country ungovernable, who led wave after wave of industrial strikes, supported by tens of millions around the world, some of you who are in this room, we actually won our liberation. We actually defeated a system of apartheid, which seemed extraordinarily powerful when I was forced to leave the country very suddenly in 1986, thinking that I will never set foot in the country of my birth again, because there was no prospect then of apartheid ending. 4 years later, our political prisoners were free. A process of negotiations started that a further 4 years from that led to our first ever democratic election. And when our first democratic president, Nelson Mandela, emerged from 27 years in an apartheid prison, one of the first things he said wasn't, "I'm free, let's have a national party." Instead, he said, our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinian people. Thank you.